Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's meeting. We'll get started in just a moment.
Hey, everyone.
Good morning.
Hi, Dr. Shimkata. Thanks for joining us today.
Hi, I'm not sure why my name is showing up as Kevin for some reason. Very strange. I'm actually having a little bit of internet issues too, so let me just see if I wonder if I can just
I can rename you if you'd like.
Can you hear me okay? Oh yeah, thank you for renaming me at least.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry, it's just saying my internet's a little unstable, so I may go off video for a moment here.
Okay, no problem. Well, we'll get started and just kick off with our agenda for today. Welcome everyone to today's Connecting for Better Health meeting. In terms of our agenda today, we're going to kick off with a presentation from Dr. Shimkata from UCLA around data equity, and kind of jump back to that topic, which we've gone over a couple of times, just around OMB updates to race and ethnicity and demographic data standards and work going on there. We have a couple other updates for folks. We'll touch on, in particular, draft policy and procedure comments that we would like to prepare with you all ahead of Monday's deadline for those. We'll give an update on AB 1331. And if time allows, we'd also like to jump to the QHIO application and some other legislative updates as well. Just want to note for folks, we are planning to host another meeting next week to be able to make sure we give fuller legislative updates since the floor sessions on this week. Dive into the participant directory, the equity and practice transformation grants announcement that came out as well. So lots to dig into there. And definitely invite folks to feel free to drop your name in the chat if you're new or if you've been with us before. Just on the next slide, just to orient everyone to the coalition, we really stand to try to bring to life this vision that every Californian and their care team has the information insights they need to make care seamless, high quality, and affordable. And as many of you know, we've been pretty focused this year around DSA education, funding, the integration of social services data, as well as on the development of the PMPs. So just one more quick announcement before we jump to our presentation for the day. We are excited for this webinar next Friday related to the Ask Me pilots. This is part of the work we've been doing with the California Healthcare Foundation around consent policy and management in California. We're super excited to have HIE and CIE speakers at this event who participated in those pilots sharing out. So please join that webinar next Friday. We'd love to see you there, and please feel free to share with your networks as well. So with that, I think next we'll move to our guest presentation and Dr. Shimkata from UCLA. And Dr. Shimkata, we'll let you share your slides as well.
Actually, Robbie, can I make a change? Would you be able to share the slides, just because I keep seeing this unstable internet show up, so I feel like it might be better if you do it on your end and I'll just let you know when to advance. Is that fine?
Perfect. Let me just pull them up for you really quickly.
Okay, thank you. And I'm gonna go off video. Yeah, hi everyone. I'm just trying to see if I recognize some faces or names, and I'm not sure I do, although I actually think I do see one. Madison, I feel like might have been somebody I worked with at Chburp. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Great to see you, Reedy.
Great to see you. Yeah, so I'm at UCLA, the Center for Health Policy Research. And thank you, Robbie, for putting that up. I am a senior research scientist there. I've been at UCLA for a number of years. I am a product of the Department of Epidemiology and kind of now straddling the world of health policy. So it's actually really neat. I think because I think what I'm talking about today, when it's talking a lot about data and kind of marrying it with sort of policy and how we move forward. So it's a nice combination, I think. So next slide, please. Thank you. So here's our agenda. I'll try to move quickly. I know there's a lot of slides, so apologies, but I thought it would be nice for you all to see kind of the work we do at the center. So there's a ton of slides, but I will start with a quick introduction to data equity, put in some definitions there. And I want to give you an example of our own survey to kind of describe how it really uses the principles of data equity that we bring up, and then some lessons from our work, and then sort of a little bit about the future. So next slide. So this is the paper, I think, that sort of brought me here. I think Robbie mentioned that he'd read this paper and thought it would be of interest to everyone. So I wanted to put this here, not only because of that, but also I wanted to introduce you to my co-authors, and especially the one on my left, that is Ninez Ponce. She's the lead author of this paper, but then she's also the lead of, or the director of our center. So this is Center for Health Policy Research, and she's also the principal investigator for the California Health Interview Survey. So under her leadership, the survey, which I'll refer to as CHIS, it's really become recognized as sort of the national model for data collection for race and ethnicity. She also serves on the data disaggregation work group for the White House. And also she's also an associate editor for diversity, equity, and inclusion at JAMA. So I think her finger is really on the pulse of equity. And I think that's why I hope some of the stuff that I show you today is fresh. And my other co-author, Paris Adkins Jackson, she's a assistant professor at Columbia University, and her research is really around the role of structural racism on health, historically marginalized populations, and just looking for better metrics on measuring adversity. So we wrote this paper with the view that, we have come a long way in our ability to measure population health. And we've built data systems that are meant to gather a large amount of data. But really, it's funny that even though with all this data, we've often really failed to capture the diversity of communities that exist within the sort of the broader groups. And then also, even if we have collected disaggregated data, they may be housed in a way that there's really no access to getting that data, and communities sometimes don't know much about themselves. But now what's nice is that we've kind of recently seen a good degree of interest in making data more representative and more accessible, which is basically the core of what it means to make data more equitable. And so in this paper, we describe also like the recent federal interest in this area and sort of priorities and how to move forward. So next slide. So I'll just, like I said, start with some definitions. I know it's no fun, but I'll do it anyway, just so that we know like what I'm saying when I talk about data equity, how is it different from health equity? So next slide. So I know we're all likely to know what the definition of health equity is, but it's really, I think the general consensus is that, health equity is basically everyone has the opportunity to reach their full health potential without any disadvantage due to social circumstances. Next slide. And really, how do we get there? Well, we need to measure. I think we've all heard the phrase, you can't improve what you don't measure. And so to really achieve health equity, we need to be able to measure. We need to be able to see where communities or populations are struggling. We need to know where they're thriving. We need to be able to have that information to build policies and programs to make sure that we are on this road to really being able to fulfill our full health potential. And we like this diagram because it's a really nice visual of how measurement is really central to really being on that road to health equity. Next slide. So how do we measure, and how do we know like where we're going to make those investments? So, like I said, we come from the field of population survey science. And in that field, I mean, we're in the field of, or we're in the science of basically having to sample populations, right? We can't measure everyone. We have to get a snapshot of people. We have to use that to then generate metrics for the population. And we generate, how we generate these statistics really, depends on like how we group people together, and how do we group them in meaningful ways is one of the biggest questions. And so what are the typical ways we tend to group people? I mean, we sort of the natural thing that we all think about is geography, right? For example, it's so important for us to know, how are the people in LA County doing, for example? How are they different from, populations in Kern County, for example? They're very different, right? So geography is one way we do it. We often do it by age. It's also very simple. We know that the youth, for example, are different from older adults. The young people share distinct issues that are common among them. So really, what is a community? Well, it's just a group of people who share something in common. And so typically the commonality we've used is like their shared histories. So for example, where they've immigrated from, where they've come from. It could be their beliefs, interests, where they live, or the relationships they have with each other. Next slide. So we also typically we regularly group by race and ethnicity. And this one's a little bit more complicated, right? Because we acknowledge that communities are often formed on the basis of shared identity of race and ethnicity. And this is especially true for recent immigrants. But we also know that there's a growing concern that people don't necessarily want to be identified solely by their race or ethnicity. And there's also this growing multiracial or multi-ethnic population that doesn't really fit into one category, right? So what is it? Like in general, race is a concept that's historically linked to physical attributes, and ethnicity has typically been linked to sort of cultural identity. So as a whole, this concept of race and ethnicity are basically categories of people based on perceived physical traits or shared cultural experiences. And really what we're saying is that, race and ethnicity play a role in shaping a person's identity and how they're basically perceived by society. And so we recognize that concepts of race and ethnicity are not perfect. And there's certainly plenty of valid criticism for, the lack of scientific validity and also in its role in perpetuating discrimination. But despite them from being perfect, like what our goal is to use these metrics to be able to address disparities and basically keep us on that road to health equity in that diagram I showed you, so that basically we want to make sure everyone can reach their full health potential despite their social circumstances. Next slide. So what is data equity? Basically, we measure people, we gather data on communities, and we generate insights with the goal to achieve health equity, right? So data equity is making sure that data are collected, processed, analyzed, interpreted, and distributed in such a way that communities are represented and have access and can actually use that data. And we know that data collection strategies really affect which populations are included, who can be identified within the data, how data are tabulated and reported, as well as how results are interpreted, affect how the experiences of populations are represented in research and in policy. And decisions around how data are distributed and who has access to it really also impacts a community's ability to understand themselves. And it's really the smaller populations and those that have been typically marginalized that are really at greater risk of not being seen. So that's where I think in the next slide, please, I think it's in the next slide. Oh no, this slide after, I'll give you an example, but here, I want to offer you an example of work that came out of our center during the pandemic. So you all are probably familiar with sort of the minimum guidelines, the OMB Directive 15 federal guidelines on how to collect race and ethnicity. And, in those guidelines, it says that, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, which is NHPI here, and Asian categories should be separated, right? Yet we found that when collecting mortality data, so many states in the US collect race and ethnicity that aren't along those federal guidelines. So they actually do combine Asian and NHPI in that category in the mortality data. So why is that important? Now, if you see, this is an example using California data, we can see here that NHPIs, that darker green, they experience significantly higher mortality than Asians. And you can see the combined category. So it's like 123 versus 75. So that combining NHPIs and Asians, because the Asian population size is so much larger, you see that when they are combined, the high mortality of NHPIs just doesn't come through in the aggregated statistics. So for states that report aggregate statistics, when they combine Asian and NHPI, we understand that it's really oftentimes it's the small sample size, and they say, well, the number of deaths within the NHPI population can't be independently reported because it's such a small sample size. But, had they shared disaggregated data, when you combine that with the other states, that information could have been reportable, NHPI statistics could have been reportable at the national level. But this type of national reporting wasn't possible because of those states that chose not to show the disaggregated data. So really the key takeaway here is not only that, the availability of disaggregated data improves our understanding, right? So here, for example, we're able to reach out to the NHPI community, but also like when you don't have the sample size to be able to report reliable statistics in your own disaggregated data for a given year, your data are still valuable because they can be combined in different ways. You could combine, over a certain time frame to build up that sample size, or you can combine to larger geographies to produce reliable statistics. And I think the bottom line is like you have an opportunity, when you do have an opportunity to collect and report disaggregated data, you should do it. And it's about representation. So next slide. So I just want to give you a quick glimpse of what we do in CHIS. And for these slides, I think I will go through pretty quickly, just because I think, Robbie, I think for time, I've got about 10 minutes left, right? Or maybe less.
Yeah, about like 8 minutes if we
Okay,
could.
so perfect. That's great. So I want to go through this really quickly and just to give you a glimpse of what we do at CHIS. So what is CHIS? We are the largest state-based population based health survey in the country, and we've got a sample of about 20,000 households annually. It's the only large-scale population survey that includes Tagalog, Vietnamese, Korean, Cantonese, Mandarin, Chinese, and Spanish in terms of language. And I think I mentioned this earlier, it's really now really seen as sort of a gold standard for other state level efforts to make on being able to collect data on ethnic communities. So we do things like oversampling certain communities, and then also, like I said, developing these linguistically appropriate instruments. I'm going to skip over the next slide, Robbie, and then we can go to this. So this is a typical breakdown of what CHIS looks like based on the minimum OMB race and ethnicity categories. I just wanted to show you of those numbers we're working with, and even in California, where we've got the highest NHPI populations in the state. I don't think it's number one in the country, but we do have one of the highest. Even then, you can see it's not terribly high. So we often have to combine multiple year data to be able to have meaningful results for our NHPI group. But because we know this group has typically been marginalized and not seen, we make it a point to create those statistics for this group in particular. So next slide. So clearly we go beyond the minimum, right? Of course we wouldn't if we weren't here. The OMB guidelines are really just the minimum, and where possible we disaggregate. And so the next slides I will go through are going to be fast because I don't want to sit here and read off to you all of the categories, but this is basically based on different advisory board guidance and alignment with census, different census categories. We have chosen these categories, and this is based on our recent 2022 data cycle. So this is how low we go in terms of our level of disaggregation. And next slide. Well, there's another thing here that makes CHIS unique. If you can just go back to that one slide, Robbie. It was, do you identify with one race in particular? This question is not typically asked. I think there's maybe one or two other federal surveys that do it. This is really to start to better understand multiracial groups, because sometimes, you know, people do report many different racial ethnic categories. And again, we don't know that this is the right way to do it, but it's certainly, we know, kind of being future proof and being future ready to know that this question can actually be very useful. And we have some work on Native American and Alaska Native community on how this question on who do you identify with one race in particular, and how important that question can be. So the next slide. This is just sort of our more recent additions for white and Black origin write-ins. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, so that was collection really quickly. So here we go to what do we do? So we aim to really provide reports and fact sheets that can be digested by communities to address specific health needs. And this includes not only reports on racial and ethnic groups, but other communities. For example, uninsured communities, undocumented communities, people who have Medi-Cal and so forth, veterans. Next slide. So all that disaggregated data also generates insights that appear in the published literature. This paper I led was looking at Asian American older adults and how we found significant variation within that group. And this work where we found Korean American older adults reported very low social and emotional support has gotten a lot of attention, and I think is really kind of the building blocks for sort of what can we do next and how to help, and a very good example of why this matters. We can skip over the next slide, Robbie, and go to distribution. So this, I really want to encourage you all, if you all are into data in general, which I think you are, if you haven't already found yourself here, Ask CHIS is a platform to really democratize data and bring data to communities, and for them to be able to generate statistics at all kinds of geographies, levels, you know, different cuts. So Ask CHIS, here's, you know, this is what it would look like. And the next slide is Ask CHIS Neighborhood Edition, where you can generate insights by neighborhood. So next, I want to quickly give you some lessons and also introduce you to some recent efforts. So we recently got a grant from RWJF to build this data equity center. So basically, we're building a space that we hope will offer resources and technical assistance to inform, support, promote data systems that are more representative, more inclusive, and collaborative with the communities they serve. So a few months ago, we held a convening with healthcare industry experts as we were trying to better understand how we've been in this population health survey space. And how can we understand what's going on in the healthcare industry space? Because I don't think we've necessarily really talked to each other before much, but I think there's so much in common and so much we can learn from each other. So a lot of the insights that are on the next slides have come from that convening. And first and foremost, I think what we know and what we've heard is that guidance is so critical. Everyone's sort of hungry for understanding, like, what do we do? How do we do this? So, what kind of data should we be collecting on race, ethnicity? How low can we disaggregate? Things like that. So this, we think, is going to just require more, conversations with communities across sectors and basically more transparency. So at CHIS, we try to be as transparent as possible, providing information on, how we've come to these metrics, how best to collect, how best to roll up data. And then also this need for just basically continuous learning and evolving, knowing that this science is kind of in flux, right? Next slide. So I think an important issue I also want to raise is that while we want to collect data on everything and everyone and everything, right? That's what it seems. We do also acknowledge that we can't really collect the whole universe of data. We have to make decisions on to what degree we can disaggregate. When are you able to go beyond the minimum? And, again, back to what I said before, you just really need to know your populations. And not only is it, kind of building relationships with your communities, but really going to your census data, knowing who, better understand who's in your population, who are you trying to pull out, who has been hidden from your data before, who's been invisible. And then also using tools like CHIS for California, there is quite a bit you can do there. Next slide. I'm not sure I want to go into this, but I think the general gist is there's just a lot of also technical issues that come in when it comes to data, right? So it's on the statistics end with regards to tabulation, weighting, imputation methods. I think these things are just becoming even more complicated. I think, as I mentioned, as we become more multiracial and multi-ethnic, is like, how are we going to handle data when we have what we do at CHIS, we have write-in categories, right? So you're going to need to use AI and to be able to grab those write-in categories and put them in, sometimes even recategorize them, things like that. So it's very technical heavy, and so this is also something that's on our radar. Next slide. Just some very big questions. I think I won't go through all of these, but I think these are probably all things that are probably top of your mind too, is, how do we go from here? And this is basically what we're trying to do at the center, is try to provide a place for resources on understanding, if I have a question on how to handle small sample sizes, how do I oversample, things like that. We can be a place for a resource hub, and then put people together and learn from each other. Next slide. So data equity in many ways is asking for like big transformational change in the way we collect data, who's represented, who has access, all of those things. And I think that's really big, sort of the big takeaway. And in the next slide, I think I just want to acknowledge that, there is notable momentum and interest on the federal level. You all may be familiar with the working group. I think the Biden-Harris administration has a working group on equitable data, and they're trying to, I think, fill in some of the gaps as well in terms of guidance. And the last slide is basically sort of aspirational. I think we really think the future of our data systems is going to have to be more community driven, and we hope to democratize data as much as possible, as we see with CHIS, is like putting data in the hands of communities you're collecting from, so that they can also be part of the process and be a part of the change in getting to health equity. So next slide is just for you to reach out to me. Our health policy, or our Data Equity Center website is currently being built. So if you go over there, you may not find much, but there's places. I think there should be a place for you to sign up to sort of stay in touch. Otherwise, you can also reach out to me. And then I don't know if I put it on the next slide, but also next week or in a couple of weeks, we have our annual data release launch, where we're going to be bringing out the 2022 data. So please join us. Again, go to the website and you can find sort of links to all of these things. And yeah, I would love to collaborate with you all. I know I've kind of spoken a lot, so not much time here, but don't hesitate to reach out to me if anyone's interested.
No, thank you so much, Dr. Shibkata. And we really appreciate the work you've done and are super excited about the new data equity work you'll be pursuing with RWJF. I see a question from Felix in the chat. I think we have time for one question, but what are some of the key applications of this work in our line of work as providers, payers, HIEs, HIOs, who are collecting and sharing, in particular, demographic information? Is it to try to make these data fields more expansive? I would add to, what are some of the possible applications of that work in terms of being able to access those data sources as well, as HIEs and, providers and others might have, lots of rich data that might be of use to you in the center.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it would be great. I think our vision or our hope is that, we'd all be able to kind of speak similar language, right? So first is to be able to hope that we're collecting data in the same ways, right? So that our categories are similar. We want to be able to speak the same language. It would just, yeah, I'm just trying to think of an example if I have one, but I don't have one off the top of my head. But when we had the convening with healthcare industry in June, we had payers at the table and providers, health systems, and it was probably one of the first times that we've actually interacted with them, even though we're at this university where literally UCLA Health is across the street from us, for example, but we never really had the conversations. But I think we're just looking for some commonalities to be able to. I think interoperability is definitely top of mind. We want our data to be useful to you, and your data to be useful to us, and definitely, yeah, more expansive, of course. But I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, definitely. I think too, let us know how we can be of help, as well as with our participants, the folks we've got here. Would love to put that offer out to you as well, and let us know how we can support your work as it moves forward too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate the presentation. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to staff or put them in the chat. We're happy to forward those on as well.
It's a great resource. We'll continue to follow as well.
Excellent. Well, I think along the same lines, we wanted to give some space next, before we jump into DXF updates, just around a recent health affairs piece around LGBTQ plus advocacy and data collection as well. And I think we've got Lisa Berry on the line, who can speak to that piece, and we'll drop it in the chat for folks too.
Yeah, can you hear me? Looks like it's working. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Nice to be with you again and to see so many familiar faces again. I really appreciated the previous presentation, in particular because there are so many sort of corollaries from that work that are sort of addressed in the piece in Health Affairs. Also, Reedy, I'll be reaching out to you because we have a program that's potentially interesting for the work you're doing as well. And so lots of stuff. Also, I'm always there's a little bit of shade, but I'm always shocked by how many interesting things RWJ is funding and how hard it is for RWJ awardees to connect with each other on the work that they're doing, because there's so many connections. We're funding this program on implementation of the Gravity Project standards across the country, and specifically in 4 different pilot sites. And the data equity work is incredibly relevant and important to that. And so it's also really relevant and important to this piece that Shruti and I wrote for Health Affairs around health data sharing and collection for LGBTQ+ advocacy. Really, it's pretty simple. We're just simply saying, hey, remember, we also have a whole range of SOGI data that is not consistently connected, is not consistently collected or specified, that is not adopted in a consistent way across all these different players. Just like race, ethnicity, and language data, SOGI data is simply not used or collected in a standardized way across the country. And this is incredibly, incredibly important. I don't want to repeat all of the potential and actual harms, but they're all there, and we describe them a little bit in the piece. But in the same way that all kinds of sensitive data, race, ethnicity, language, reproductive, and other types of sensitive health data, SOGI data, all these things, there are complex issues and histories around them, right? People rightfully are concerned about how we collect and use these data. At the same time, when we don't do it, and the answer is we just do nothing, we have no idea, there are also incredible harms on that side too. The answer is not to not collect and not share. The answer is to find appropriate frameworks and governance over how we collect and share and use those data. And so we're just trying to shine a light here to say, hey, this also needs to be considered. There are incredible harms when we don't consistently collect and share and use. And there are relevant connections to a lot of things in the national and state landscape. So whether it's TEFCA at the national level or expansion of what we call the health data utility model across the different regions and states, or in California, the data exchange framework and all the work around consent and social services data sharing, these things, we cannot ignore the issue of not appropriately and in a standardized way collecting and using SOGI data, just like everything else. So I think we really just wanted to shine a light on it and maybe start the conversation a little bit more. If you haven't read it, it's not super long. I think it's pretty easy to read. So take a minute and add your comments. We'd love to do more work on this front. So if there are people on this call who are like, let's keep this going, we'd love to do that.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for publishing that important piece, Lisa, and Shruti too. And yeah, we'd love to keep up the conversation here as well. So please let us know how we can help serve as a forum or sounding board for some of these ideas too. And also, I think for folks out there too, thinking about how we can use the data exchange framework to advance standards development as well. So thanks so much, Lisa. And I think next we can turn to some state updates in particular. So I think just to kick us off as we're pulling up our meeting slides, I think as many of you know, AB 1331 related to the data exchange framework is now a 2-year bill. So that's the latest update coming out of appropriations right before Labor Day. I think what we've seen is, I think some folks who had issues with the bill or with the data exchange framework, I think were able to successfully kind of put a hold on this bill moving forward this year. That's not to say it won't be revived next year in the second year of the session. There also may be trailer bill language in a budget bill next year that makes some changes to the data exchange framework through statute. I think we'd really love to just say thank you to everyone who signed on to our letter. It was great to see such a great smattering of organizations from across healthcare and technology sign on. But I think certainly one lesson learned, we'd love to really, energize, activate our participants, I think, in the next go around to really do more meet and greets with legislators and staff around the framework and, the importance of this work and kind of getting the law on it right as well. So I think that's something, in the next push that we'll make sure to really convey to everyone and sort of rally the troops, if you will, as well. Felix, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Robbie. Definitely echo your sentiments about, the gratitude for, most, I guess, the plurality of folks who are on this regular coalition call for getting behind the bill, for lending their support, for signing on, their logo, all of that. To your earlier point that, the bill was, made a 2-year bill due to the successful efforts of the opposition. I think that the inverse of that gratitude is the need to recognize that, let's just put it out there. There are some attendees on this call who are known to represent interests that were working against the bill, actively working against the bill. I know this is an open invite forum. I do think that if this coalition is going to discuss and potentially coalesce around positions of advocacy on legislation, whether it's support or opposition or concerns, that if that becomes part of the priorities and strategy of this group moving forward, then there needs to be some reckoning, right, with the fact that there are those who disagree with the position and who are also listening in on the calls and taking back some of the planning and the strategy to their side, so to speak. So, I don't mean to make it, really awkward or uncomfortable, but that's just kind of the reality of working at the intersection of politics and policy.
100% agree. Thank you, Felix, for putting that out there. And I think as we grow and mature, we are, looking at just that of what kind of rules or pieces in our charter that need to be put in place, and also what our advocacy group will do, and whether or not that's a sidecar or something like that. We're growing and we're maturing. So I think more on that after lessons learned this year. But thank you for saying what I think we were all thinking.
Excellent. Any questions or other thoughts from folks?
I do want to acknowledge that the work that went into this bill, Robbie, the team that you pulled together that gave such amazing and thoughtful insight is still there. So that work is there that can be picked up. And as you said, either in the early months of next year and or in the second year of the bill. So if you haven't read it all, I would definitely have everyone on the call take a look at it again, so that we can start putting it in all of our vocabulary as we're out speaking to leadership and policy leadership. The blueprint is there.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone. To be continued. I think just moving on to our next item, for folks just to know, we'll at our next meeting dive a little bit deeper into the participant directory proposal that was outlined at the last CDII meeting. But today wanted to move to a couple of policies and procedures that have been put out in draft form. For folks to know, in case you're interested in submitting your own comments, these are due on the 18th, next Monday at 8 a.m. So bright and early. And really, there's 2 key PMPs out for comment. One, making updates to privacy protections and security safeguards, and another related to the requirement to exchange health and social services information. We circulated a draft earlier this week, a slightly updated one with our materials today. We'd love to spend a little time on these today at this meeting, just to see if anyone has any input here right now in terms of how we might be able to improve some of these comments. So I think just starting with privacy and security, a couple key topics that we've pointed out here include de-identification. So what this proposal will do is that, prior to using or disclosing de-identified HSSI, the participant would need to make sure that it's done consistent with existing law in the federal regulations. What we've got here is, support for this, especially as it pertains to de-identification, especially for those orgs that aren't necessarily already subject to HIPAA or other laws. Then additionally related to non-covered entities and their PHI procedures, the proposal is around, that participants wouldn't be able to access user disclosed PHI received from a participant except in line with certain provisions in HIPAA. So one recommendation here that we noted is around amending the provision to align with the requirements outlined in permitted, required, and prohibited purposes. In particular, just noting that in that policy and procedure, there are several instances where the DSA, requires sharing data versus it being permitted under HIPAA, and to make sure that distinction is clear here too. And then an additional point that was raised by a colleague via email is around a concern around participants who aren't traditionally subject to HIPAA, potentially needing to segment data received under the DSA in order to comply with this provision around subsequent uses and disclosures. And the concern that this may create burdens for those entities, given that HIPAA, is designed to, really support certain workflows for healthcare organizations, and that those may not always align necessarily with those in social services. And then lastly, around the minimum necessary standard applying to non-covered entities, generally voicing support for, extension of minimum necessary, but also asking for clarification from CDII around whether it intends to require the application of minimum necessary to uses and disclosures that fall within treatment under HIPAA, given that under HIPAA, those aren't currently subject to the minimum necessary standard. So we'll pause there, see if folks have any thoughts around these three items at all. And we're happy to take input over email too. All right, I think on the next slide, just a couple other items here. Updates to existing BAAs. Really, this calls for those that sign the DSA to make sure that their business associate agreements or other contracts comply with the DSA and don't conflict. Additionally, around destruction, the addition of language around participants, destroying information that's received in error. Just pointing as well to some methods that, OCR has put out in an FAQ around destruction and pointing to those as a potential guide for organizations. Then additionally around behavioral health and other protected information, right now the draft, calls out specific behavioral health privacy laws, and just recommending that CDII consider doing that for other specific laws, whether child welfare, potential ones around reproductive health, those around minor consent and such as well. So I'd love to see if others have thoughts. I see a comment around extending privacy protections in a clear way for data that moves to non-covered entities. Thanks for that, Lisa. I think that's super helpful. Any other thoughts on any of these items from folks? All right, and then one more.
Rafi? Hi, it's Mary Sarah. I have a question. Is there an underlying assumption in here? Because there's a really big focus on the non-HIPAA covered entities. Is there an assumption that the HIPAA covered entities have access to the non-healthcare data? I haven't heard a lot about kind of the limitations of sharing the social care data.
Yeah, good question. I think that is the assumption, since HSSI would include both health and social services information, which encompasses both PHI and PII. So yes, I think that definitely is the assumption.
And that would create issues with some of the some of the policies that encompass the different social care groups. So that would be one concern. And then the other concern is for that non-healthcare data, are there protocols defining what the data set for each of them will be? Because that'll be one way to get to kind of the minimum necessary and will help restrict kind of some of the privacy concerns.
Yeah, that's a good question. Hasn't been defined quite yet, but that could be something we call out in the comments, Mary Sarah, is the need to provide more definition around those data sets, especially for the non-PHI data.
Yeah, and LA County did that really well in a couple data sharing initiatives that they had at a county level, and one specifically for child welfare. So I can share that and maybe we can use it as an example.
That'd be great. We'd love to include that. Any other questions or thoughts? All right, just moving on, a couple other items, one around trainings. The proposal is to require trainings no less than annually around policies and procedures. This seems to be the best practice, so it's not required under HIPAA. Around record retention, this would require organizations to retain records of trainings for at least 6 years, which also aligns with HIPAA requirements. And then lastly, just around removal of individual user education language. What we recommended is that CDII consider continuing to keep this language in there around resources to point stakeholders to, around consent, individual user education. And I think too, just call out, the need to really make sure that all those resources are aligned with the DXF and other existing laws. So the state health information guidance, as well as CalAIM data sharing authorization guidance to, point those out for folks, but also, make sure that those are all aligned as well. Any thoughts or questions from folks? All right, I think we can move to the one other proposal and some thoughts here around the exchange requirement to exchange HSSI. So just first around error messages, null responses, just voicing support for the subsection, just to outline for participants the instances in which you need to send an error message or null response, to let other folks know, hey, I don't have the data, or I can't produce it for you. Additionally, removal of language related to response timeframes, voicing support for that so that we make sure we're just not putting in conflicting language that might conflict with the information blocking prohibitions, PMP, or the real-time exchange one. And then additionally, just around required and voluntary participants, supporting the intention to clarify that the DSA can take effect early if participants so choose. But just making clear that, it's related, like they make clear that you can exchange HSSI under the DSA and kind of distinguish that from, the general ability to share data. I think it was just kind of an issue of copy edits there. And then lastly, on this one, related to removal of language for readiness, just voicing support for the removal of some language that was previously in there around being technologically ready and able to exchange health and social services information. I think just stating that, this language isn't necessarily needed, given that, the law is pretty clear around the need to start sharing data at certain points in time, and also around, ambiguity related to this term meaningful exchange that was included in there. And then lastly, around consent, around clarifying that the policy doesn't override or supersede any restrictions placed on the sharing of data by individuals or representatives. Just considering adding language, clarifying for participants that they need to comply with existing law that may or may not require, participants to accept all restrictions that are put forward by individuals, and also making sure to add a similar language or reference it in the permitted, required, prohibited purposes PMP to just make sure we've got consistency in terms of how we're referring to individual access and restrictions as well. So I know that was a lot, but any thoughts or reactions or questions on these from folks?
Robbie, what's the turnaround that we have on this?
Yeah, so I think next what we'd love to do is like welcome any input, through today and early tomorrow. I think we'd love to then circulate a final draft with folks. And would welcome if your organization would like to, sign on to this as well. We're happy to add you to these comments. So we will circulate another draft with folks and let us know if you'd like to add your name to these comments.
By when?
Because of the tight turnaround, I think let's give folks through the weekend, so through Sunday, just because they are due at 8 a.m. on Monday.
Great. All right, I hope everybody found these helpful. I think it's worthwhile to go through it in this kind of detail and to give this feedback. So, and if I guess you've already said this, Robbie, but if your organization is already doing your own response, we would love to see it and learn from it too.
Yes, please let us know if you have any thoughts or additions to the comments. And we've got just a couple minutes left. I think what we'll do next week is we'll do a deeper dive into the QHIO application with folks. But do recommend if you're interested in learning more, there's a guidance document online, the actual application. CDII also hosted 2 recent webinars. So we'll get into this a little bit more next week.
And just, Robbie, just if everybody can mark their calendars, because of the conflict that we have with our regularly scheduled meeting, we moved it up because there's so much to go through to next week. So please make sure that you have this meeting on your calendar for next week.
Yes. Thank you for that reminder, Timmy. And just really quickly too, we'll go over legislative updates next week. There are a couple bills still moving right now, likely to be signed by the governor. So I think given that, floor votes will end this week, and some updates are likely this afternoon on some of these bills. We'll get to some of these next week, but I think in particular AB 254, 352, and just on the next slide, SB 582 is still moving as well. And then just really quickly around news and events, just to remind folks, the summit is coming up later this month, the 28th to 29th. I think registration is full at this point, but if, I think if you're still interested in attending, let us know. We can probably put you on a wait list. So reach out to staff on that because the registration portal's closed. Colleagues at Blue Shield just wanted to share this upcoming event later in the month too, related to addressing health-related social needs. So check out that event too. And then just additionally on the next slide, just a couple other things. Webinar next Friday. Please tune in. We'd love to see you there around Ask Me. Other upcoming events include the California Telehealth Policy Coalition's annual meeting in person on November 8th. If you're interested in learning more about telehealth policy, come join us at the Endowment Space in Sacramento. And then just a couple other participants, events on here, CAP, APG, and the like too. And just 2 other quick updates. We'll dive into these next week too. Equity and Practice Transformation Payments Program. Information's come out about that. We'll dive into that next week, but definite implications for funding HIE and HIT for practices. And just additionally on the next slide, an RFI was put out by Senator Cassidy related to gathering more information on ways to improve privacy protections for health data. So super relevant to our work, and we'll discuss that next week as well. I think we're right at the top of the hour. So mark your calendars for next week. You should have, if you're registered, received a hold on your calendar. It's updated in the back end on Zoom as well. So hope to see folks at 11 next Thursday. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for joining, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care.